Good afternoon and welcome to our 2025 Constitution Day event. This year we have been celebrating and discussing George Washington's constitutional legacy. The title of our Constitution Day theme is American Cincinnatus. That's a recognition that Washington accomplished something exceptional. He, like the Roman namesake that's in the title, possessed an unparalleled amount of power as a military and political leader in America and laid it down in conformity with the constitutional order. He was willing to surrender his power for the public interest. And that leaves future generations of Americans indebted to George Washington in a special way. Now, last week we began our Constitution Day celebration with an event commemorating his military leadership and had on campus with us a large number of ROTC and junior ROTC units from around Utah. And tragically, in the midst of that day, we were interrupted. Our campus was accosted by a tragedy, by Charlie Kirk's untimely murder. We have picked up the pieces over the last week, and in an act of resolve, though we have not been able to go forward with all of the programming we had imagined, there was planned for today a large crowd of K-12 students, roughly 600 students, would have joined us this morning to hear further about George Washington's leadership as president. We are continuing with our program with a couple of distinguished guests to help us remember the constitutional order that we've inherited. And I think it's appropriate on Constitution Day to think about the kind of thing that Washington did. Washington furnished us, like our greatest statesmen, with the capability to lead his country both in war, to protect it, to risk his life for it, and to lead it in peace as a statesman. And it is a reminder to us that political leadership, sometimes surprisingly and in contexts we don't expect, requires courage. Fundamentally, we talk about and have been talking about, as a country and as a campus, the need to restore a tradition of civic discourse, the ability to speak to one another across our differences. Sometimes we're tempted to talk of that as though it consists of a skill set, as though we can just teach people some skills, how to speak, what to say, what to do, sort of mechanically. But that risks forgetting that civic life and civic discourse, especially when we confront people we disagree with and when we wrestle with our fellow citizens over what our country ought to do and of what our laws ought to consist, involves the exercise of virtues. Foremost among those is courage. It takes courage. It's always taken courage. Even just to confront disagreement takes courage. Human beings fear the disapproval of our fellow man. That speaks well of us in many ways because we care what other human beings think. We want to be in fellowship and community with them. It pains us to think that we're at odds or that we'd be ostracized. And so when we have something to say that our fellow citizens don't want to hear, or we go into a place where our ideas are not welcome, it takes great courage to speak forthrightly about our convictions. And occasionally, things like what happened last week remind us vividly of that fact, that the courage it takes is sometimes not just social, but physical courage. Washington's a tremendous example of that. I want to say, too, that this kind of civic discourse also takes charity. Courage is the courage to confront, but our civic charity, a love of one's fellow citizens and of the community, is what tells us what motivates that confrontation. It's not just the courage to confront your fellow citizens, but the question of why. It takes love of your fellow man to say things your fellow citizens don't want to hear. And so, as we engage each other, as we continue with our tradition of civil liberty and civic discourse, I want to remind us here and the folks who are joining us in our live stream that we have to summon up our courage and remind ourselves of what we hold in common with our fellow citizens so that we can exercise the virtues it takes to remain one people. And if anything unites the American people, we have a lot of differences. It's our constitutional inheritance. Americans are attached to our Constitution, and we ought to be. It is a good Constitution. We are charged with preserving it, and we're charged occasionally with improving it. And to do that work well, we're going to have to talk to each other about some difficult things. So, it is my pleasure to reaffirm and initiate our commitment to engaging our fellow citizens in civic discourse about our Constitution by introducing a great friend and colleague, Nicholas Cole. He is a senior research fellow and the academic director at Pembroke College and Oxford University. He is also the director of the Quill Project, which is contributing to the public and courts and scholars' access to Americans' constitutional tradition. It is doing the work of recording, making available and understandable the debates that Americans have had in our constitutional conventions, in our Congresses, at the moments when Americans have had to make great decisions and have gathered together to make them using civic discourse. But Nicholas has done a good work there, and we have been privileged in the Center for Constitutional Studies to partner with him. Many of the students in this room have worked on the Quill Project, and it is a great benefit to us as well as to our fellow Americans and to the scholarship of the American tradition. So I would like to introduce my friend Nicholas Cole, and please welcome him.
Matthew, thank you so much for those kind words of introduction and for the words you spoke about civic courage and charity. I don't think I can just launch straight into a talk without acknowledging the awfulness of what happened last week. I've been coming to this campus for 8 years, and in fact the first computer code I wrote for the Quill Project, I wrote 10 years ago. The partnership with this center has been crucial, foundational to that whole project for the last 8 years. The work that the students have done throughout all of that time is, I know, by accident, relied upon around the country and is famous internationally. Somebody asked me a few minutes ago how I found out about what had happened on this campus, and I found out because people from around the world who know how closely I work with you here were sending me text messages asking if UVU was all right. So thank you for all of that. I'm going to talk today about Washington's role in the creation of the Constitution. Those of you who know the records of the Constitutional Convention well might think that I have set myself a very difficult task because aside from two moments that I will talk about, Washington is almost entirely absent from the record. He's silent. And sometimes Washington's role in the creation of the Constitution generally, and specifically the presidency, appears to be almost a passive one. An office was created for him, and he graciously agreed to fill it. I think that's only part of what we should understand. So what I hope to do over the next 30 to 40 minutes is lead you through some of the broader context of that episode and Washington's part in it. If you take nothing else away, hang on to the idea that both those who supported the idea of a new constitution for America and those who opposed it thought that Washington's support for the document, Washington's involvement in its drafting, was critical to its passage, and that if Washington had refused to take part in the Constitutional Convention, it would have been much more difficult for the Constitution to have gone into effect. And you might like to remember too that, for example, the margin by which the Constitution was agreed to in the New York Ratifying Convention was 4 votes. So the Constitution was on a knife edge. Washington's involvement in the project was critical. I've just got on the screen there a section of Article 2, which is the role of the presidency, and I didn't pick the beginning. I picked a little bit lower down where the president is set out to be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States and also the militias, and the oath of office. One of the themes in this talk is going to be that sense of duty to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. That was part of the office from the beginning. But why Cincinnatus? Well, the most frequent image, I am sure, I haven't counted, but the most frequently copied image of Washington is this one that you see on the left here. This subtly classical depiction of Washington. He's in modern dress, but in a modern military uniform. And next to him is a large bundle of rods and an axe, although the axe is being covered. He's accompanied, in other words, by fasces, the Roman symbol of both civil and military authority. And when it was military authority, there was an axe in the bundle, and when it was merely civil authority, the axe was removed. And so the statue is commemorating the moment at which Washington gave up military authority and retired back to private life. This was a very remarkable moment, because had Washington been a different sort of person, he might have chosen a different path. His officer corps were ready to mutiny. His officer corps had indeed met to begin conspiring to mutiny. The civilian government of the United States had not prosecuted, in their view, the war properly. There were many debts domestically unpaid. The country seemed as if it might be on the edge of chaos. And Washington faced down that mutiny and also very, very publicly surrendered command. I've also got there a portrait on the right of Washington in which is depicted the badge of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I've got at the bottom of the screen Washington's own insignia as member of the society, which was even more splendid than the standard version. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Society of the Cincinnati as we go on. But that was the fraternal society set up by the officer corps after the end of the war. Washington's perhaps a slightly unlikely revolutionary, large landowner in Virginia. You might have thought the kind of person who, had the revolution gone a different way, might have had an awful lot to lose. And he had also been a great patriot for the empire. He had fought and risked his life as colonel of the Virginia militia. He'd got a commission from the lieutenant governor, because the governor himself wasn't even in the colony. He'd hoped for a commission in the British Army, but had been frustrated by imperial politics and the disdain that the British felt for people who lived in the colonies. And that disrespect that Washington felt in that moment was, I think, something that first awakened his American patriot spirit. Nowadays, you're very sensible in America, and there is always an equivalent rank between your federal military and your state military, so everybody knows where they fit. But the British were not quite so sensible during the 7 Years' War, and so Washington could be the most senior officer of the Virginia militia, but because his commission was only from the lieutenant governor, he was outranked by the most junior officer with a commission from the king. And that's got to hurt. He was also very offended by the proclamation line. This was an effort by the British after the war to frustrate further expansion westward. Washington had a great interest in land speculation and the opportunities of moving further westward, and he thought that this was an arbitrary act by the British government. And so in 1774, he signs the Fairfax Resolves. And I think one of the things that shines through in those resolves is the sense in which there is an offended honor. There's a sense of disrespect. The first line of those resolves reads, "Resolved that this colony and this dominion of Virginia cannot be considered as a conquered country, and that the powers over the people of America now claimed by the British House of Commons, in whose election we have no share, and in whose determinations we have no influence, whose information must always be defective and false, who in many instances may have a separate and in some the opposite interest to ours, and who are removed from those impressions of tenderness and compassion arising from personal intercourse and connection, which soften the rigors of the most despotic governments must, if continued, establish the most grievous and intolerable species of oppression and tyranny that was ever inflicted upon mankind." This is a document that's drawing on many ideas, but the theme of it, I think, is this claim of equal respect and legitimacy. There was an episode during the war that I think is very important. This is Washington's account of it. A British officer came under a flag of truce to talk to Washington, bearing a letter from the British Commander-in-Chief. And it was addressed to George Washington, Esquire. And Washington told his men to refuse to accept the letter because it was not addressed to His Excellency General Washington. It showed a disrespect. And Washington writes about this episode to the President of the Continental Congress, and he says, "Look, I didn't send this messenger away and insist on this letter being readdressed just because of my own sense of dignity, but I thought it a duty to my country and my appointment to insist on the respect which in any other than a public view I would willingly have waived." He wanted to be treated with respect. He thought it was important for the American nation that he be treated with respect and properly addressed. And this sense of insisting upon dignity and respect even carries through to the moment when Washington accepted the surrender of British forces. This is a famous depiction of the scene. The British commander may or may not have been actually ill, but was not there to surrender his sword, leaving it to his deputy. And so Washington is not the person in the middle of the picture accepting the surrender. He sent his deputy, because if the British were going to send their deputy to surrender, he was going to send his deputy to accept it. He was, to the last in that conflict, insistent that America be treated with respect and alert to the slights of a distant imperial power. I hope we've got over it. In laying down his command, he wrote a public letter to the States, the circular letter. We could spend a whole hour, we could spend many hours just talking about the circular letter. We won't, don't worry. But I do encourage you to read it. But he asked for 4 things. He asked for a reorganization of the Union, an indissoluble union of the states under one federal head. He asked for a sacred regard to public justice. America should honor its debts. He goes into a lot of detail about what he means by a sacred regard to public justice, establishment of a proper peace establishment, and so on. So Washington, in this moment, in 1783, sets out very clearly that he thinks that the current union is defective and it needs to be changed, and he hopes it will be changed. And with that, he retires into private life, lays down his command, goes back to his farm. And in 1787, in the spring of 1787, people start trying to call him out of retirement. And it's not a story that we often dwell upon, and so I want to dwell a little bit on Washington's misgivings in that moment about coming out of retirement and about going to the Philadelphia Convention and what it took to persuade him. And the correspondence that I want to look at is correspondence between Washington and Henry Knox and Washington and James Madison. There is a context, and the context is violence. And you see this in the letters that are exchanged on this. The correspondence moves seamlessly back and forwards between a discussion of the violence of Shays' Rebellion that had just occurred, and the possibility of a convention. So he moves from a paragraph talking about the need to punish the people that had instigated the rebellion, and he says, I think that there should be some exemplary punishment, with the happy thought that the Congress, the Continental Congress, had decided that it would put its weight behind the idea of a convention. I'm glad to hear, he says, that the Congress are about to remove some of the stumbling blocks which lay in the way of a proposed convention, a convention I would wish to see tried. But he doesn't expect it to be successful. He says, after which, if the present government is not efficient, the conviction of a propriety of change will disseminate through every rank and class of people and may be brought about in peace, till which, however, it may be necessary, however necessary it may appear in the eyes of more discerning people, my opinion is that it cannot be effected without great contention and much confusion. It is among the evils, and perhaps not the smallest, of democratical governments that the people must feel before they can see. Reason is not enough. Sometimes things have to go very, very badly wrong before people will put them right. And Washington doesn't think in this moment that one constitutional convention is going to be enough. Washington thinks that it might not be sufficient. So he's quite reluctant. And he's got another issue on his mind as well. This is March, so the clock is ticking. I mean, this is barely 2 months before the convention meets. His other problem is that the Society of the Cincinnati are going to meet in Philadelphia at the same time, and there is a lot of suspicion of the Society of the Cincinnati because they not only were a fraternal club for the officers of the army that had disbanded, with chapters in every state, but they had written into their founding document that they would be a hereditary society. In other words, that the male heirs of the members of the Cincinnati, the officer corps of Washington's army, would be members of the society. And Washington realized that the public did not really trust that this was a properly Republican institution. And he said, look, I don't think they meant any harm by it, but it makes it very difficult for me. He wasn't sure he wanted to go and really lend his name publicly to that meeting. And he writes to Madison in similar terms. I'm glad to find that Congress have recommended to the states to appear in a convention. I think there are probably more reasons in favor than against. There's this hesitancy, reluctance to fully embrace it. He's worried that it might go wrong. But he hopes that the defects of the Constitution can be remedied. And he says, I'm also glad that Congress hasn't laid out too clearly a plan of action. That might have sounded the alarm. In other words, if Congress had said very clearly exactly what the new Constitution should be like, the public might have not been in favor of it. And you have to remember not only the background of violence, the background of distrust of government. Washington is very nervous that the convention might not be a success, but also in this letter, very nervous that even holding a constitutional convention might excite further, possibly rebellion and violence. And I think today the American public are very nervous about what might happen in a constitutional convention in the same way. But I think whatever reluctance that current Americans feel, Washington feels even more. He thinks that there are people in the states that might be losing confidence altogether in Republican government. And he says, I'm fully of the opinion that those who lean towards a monarchical government have either not consulted the public mind or they live in a place where there's a sort of strange interplay of a sort of reaction against sort of the leveling principles of Republican government. So he's worried about how far a reaction against the chaos of the late 1780s might go. So he feels hemmed in on all sides by these concerns, and so is very, very reluctant to go along. One of the things he's worried about, though, that suggests to him that he should be going to the convention is that the Treaty of Paris, the treaty that secured America's independence from Britain, at least in the eyes of the British, was being disregarded by state governments. And if you later look at the slides, you'll see he says in a slightly earlier slide, you know, we should be so abiding by the treaty that we make the British the bad guys, but we haven't learned that lesson. So some of the provisions of the Treaty of Paris were that creditors, British creditors, would be able to recover their debts, the money that Americans owed them, that they hadn't paid, that the states would return confiscated land or confiscate confiscated land to the tourists that had been forced out, that there would be an end to confiscations, and that in return there would be a removal of British troops and a return of papers and so on to the Americans. And the British were sort of poking America and not quite abiding by their obligations under the treaty, and Washington's view was America ought to be behaving better to comply with its obligations, but the states found those obligations very difficult. He says here, had we observed good faith on our part, we might have told our tale to the world with a good grace. But it looks to everybody like we've been found to be the first aggressors. We are breaching the treaty. He goes on to say to Madison, look, I'm also clear that even admitting the utility of a constitutional convention, there are many reasons why it might not be a good idea. Knox wrote back to Washington and said, look, we need you there. With respect to the convention in May next, it appears to me that the attendance of General Washington would be of very great importance. The probability of his acceptance would greatly facilitate the appointment of characters of the first magnitude from all the states, and his presence would inspire confidence and ensure success. In other words, the people trying to organize the Constitutional Convention are very, very clear that if Washington refuses to go, that the whole project might fail. And there's even Knox knows how to persuade Washington. He says if he should decline, it might be construed as a dereliction of duty. Your name, sir, stands in high estimation of all good men, and your participation would be seen as a pledge for the public good. And if you don't go, Madison tries a different tack, which is to try and lay out to Washington what the convention is going to achieve. And he writes a long letter on the 16th of April, so the clock is really ticking if they're going to persuade Washington to attend. He writes a long letter saying what he's going to try and achieve. And he lays out his vision of federalism, which goes very much further towards the creation of a centralized national government that the convention would ultimately adopt. But he says, look, I've tried to steer a middle ground between fully consolidating the states and leaving them as these independent governments. We're going to have to talk about the principle of representation. Madison tells Washington states can't have an equal vote in the national government. He wants the federal government to be armed with positive and competent authority in all cases that require uniformity. So the convention will talk about that. And Madison wants the federal government to have a negative on state laws. This is an idea that he repeats at the convention and that doesn't get support, but it sort of hints at where Madison is in his thinking in this time. He says, this negative, as heretofore exercised by kingly prerogative, well, this seems to me absolutely necessary to prevent the states from encroaching on federal power. And of course, for the last 230 years, America has had to argue about the proper line between state and federal power. Madison goes into more detail and says the legislative department needs to be divided into two branches, and he starts to lay out his constitutional theory, and he comes to the executive, the office that Washington will eventually hold, and he says, the national supremacy in the executive department is liable to some difficulty, he says. But he says the state militias ought certainly to be placed in some form or other under the authority which is entrusted to the general government. We must have a president, we must have a national executive, but I don't really have fully developed views on this, he says. And acknowledging the violence of the moment, he says, an article should be inserted expressly guaranteeing the tranquility of the states against internal as well as external dangers. And of course, that is a provision that does make it into the Constitution. I've tried to give you a flavor of the detail in which Madison is laying out his hopes for the convention as a way of persuading Washington to attend. And Washington is still uncertain on the 2nd of April and says, look, I really feel very torn about this. I'm not sure I want to come. And he's explicit about this problem of the Cincinnati. If I should attend this convention, I'll be at Philadelphia previously to attend the meeting of the Cincinnati. And he said, I'm going to ask them to get rid of the hereditary principle. He asks Knox, do you think they'll go along with it? I'll just tell you as an aside what happens at that meeting, because Washington does go to the meeting of the Society of the Cincinnati, and he makes an impassioned plea from the chair, and he says, gentlemen, please, you are frightening your fellow Republicans, give up the principle of hereditary succession to membership of the Society, meet and tell war stories, and agitate for your economic and political interests, but please, please, please get rid of this hereditary principle. And they shuffle their feet and say, well, tell you what, Your Excellency, General Washington, we'll put it out to a vote of the state chapters. So they put it out to a vote of the state chapters, and the state chapters don't agree. And so there is a building. Some of us were there a few days ago for a conference. There is a building a few blocks from the White House for the Society of the Cincinnati, which still exists. So what happened at the convention? Well, Washington appears twice in the convention, and one time is to tell everybody off. And I'm going to give you a flavor of what it's like to be on the receiving end of Washington being cross with you. Because William Pierce recounts that one of the members of the convention had very carelessly left one of the order papers for the convention lying around in the state capitol, and it was fortunately picked up by another member of the convention, but it might have got into the newspapers, and that would have caused all manner of trouble. So at the end of the 1st of June, 1787, after the motion to adjourn has been accepted, Washington says the following, gentlemen, I am sorry to find that one member of this body has been so neglectful of the secrets of this convention as to drop in the State House a copy of their proceedings, which by accident was picked up and delivered to me this morning. I must entreat the gentleman to be more careful, lest our transactions get into the newspapers and disturb the public repose by premature speculations. I know not whose paper this is, but there it is, and he threw it down on the desk. Let him who owns it take it. And at this point he bowed, picked up his hat, and quitted the room with a dignity so severe that every person was alarmed. He was unanimously elected to the chair of the convention. But if you think of that election in the context of all that had gone before, Washington is scarcely an entirely neutral figure. Washington has been persuaded very reluctantly to go to the convention to make it a success, and has been promised that a proper national government will result. And everybody knew that. Everybody knew what he had written in 1783. Everybody knew that Washington believed that a fundamental change was needed if America was to flourish. And so by electing him to the chair, the delegates are not merely electing one of the most famous, if not the most famous person in America. I think the only other person that could vie for that title who was also there was Franklin. But they are also saying, look, there is a project here that we intend to see through. Washington makes only one other speech in the record, and that is one of the very last amendments to the Constitution on the very final day. This is the only bit of the Quill Project I will feed you in these remarks, I promise, but it just shows you the change. There was a late change to increase the representative nature of the House of Representatives to have more representatives, in other words. And Washington, very unusually, rose from the chair and instead of simply asking for a vote, said that he thought that this was really important. He said his role had not let him comment on any other issue, but this one he wished to comment on, and he thought that it should be adopted. The records confirm that this was the only intervention of that nature that he ever made. And one of the reasons he says it's really important is that the Constitution needs to be as democratic as possible. Well, what about the creation of the presidency? Washington's sitting in the chair of the convention, listening to the debates about what the powers of the president should be. This is the list. It's not a complete list, but it captures the large part. This is a list of the powers that William Blackstone, in his commentaries, which were very fashionable at the time, said that the king possessed. So the king was the supreme executive magistrate. He had the power of calling, proroguing, and dissolving parliament, assenting to laws, conducting war and peace, sending and receiving ambassadors, making treaties and alliances, safe conducts and passport issuing, command of the armed forces. All of the courts acted in his name. He had a power of pardon and the regulation of commerce, things like weights and measures. Until a very few years ago, every pint glass in Britain had a little crown on it, which I think was the last vestige of the idea that one of the purposes of the king, one of the powers, was to regulate weights and measures. Well, what about the office created for America's Cincinnatus? Well, he is going to be the supreme executive magistrate, says that at the start of Article 2. He will have command of the armed forces, and he will have a power of pardon. But everything else is given either to a different branch of government or given to the president only when acting on the advice and consent of other people. So the office that Washington is offered is a very different office to the office of the king. So when Washington takes up this office, what is the thing that is most important to him? Well, one of the very first letters he writes is to his vice president, John Adams. This is a very rarely read letter, but one of my favorites. And it's about dignity. And it's in the third person. Washington's experimenting with writing to Adams in the third person. So he writes a letter. I remember finding this as a student and thinking, this is going to be very exciting. The first letter from the President of the United States to the new Vice President. The President of the United States wishes to avail himself of your sentiments on the following points. And you think, well, what policy is Washington going to be worried about? He's not worried about policy at all in this moment. He's worried about how much he needs to remove himself from society. How many times a week do I need to entertain people in my official capacity? Can I still attend tea parties? Can I still have a private life? Can I still have friends? He's concerned that he should properly establish the dignity of the office. Does he need to be completely secluded from society, as monarchs were? Or can he find another course? Adams writes back and says, look, we're a republic. Don't worry quite so much about it. Of course you can go to tea parties. But you're going to have to do a lot of public entertaining. And I'm not sure you're going to get away with 2 days a week for public entertaining, he says. I'm just going to dwell on one other episode, and that is the episode when George Washington actually went out as president and as commander-in-chief. The only time it's ever happened, which was the occasion of another rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion. And because of the events of a few days ago, I think this letter deserves to be thought about in some detail. So indulge me this. Washington knew that members of his own government had been involved in stirring up discord, in stirring up distrust of the government. They had formed themselves into private societies that held meetings where resolutions were debated about how awful the government was, and Washington felt that this mischief would lead the country to ruin. And he writes to acquaintance of his, the insurrection of the western counties of the state is a striking example of the mischief that I expected, and may be considered the first ripe fruit of the democratic societies, as these bodies called themselves. And then he writes the longest sentence in any of his correspondence. I cannot find a longer sentence, and I think it just shows you how angry he is. So bear with me, it's going to take 3 slides. I did not, I confess, expect that it would come to maturity so soon, though I never had a doubt that such conduct would produce some such issue if it did not meet the frowns of those who were disposed to order and government, the obligation to disapprove of this kind of behavior. Sentence continues, for can anything be more absurd, more arrogant, or more pernicious to the peace of society than for self-created bodies, forming themselves into permanent censors, and under shade of night in a conclave, resolving that acts of Congress which have undergone the most deliberate and solemn discussion by the representatives of the people, chosen for the express purpose, and bringing with them from the different parts of the Union the sense of their constituents, endeavoring as far as the nature of the thing will admit to form their will into laws for the government of the whole, semicolon. I wonder what he would have made of social media. I say under these circumstances, for a self-created permanent body, for no one denies the right of the people to meet occasionally to petition for or remonstrate against any act of the legislature, to declare that this act is unconstitutional, that that act is pregnant of mischief, and that all who vote contrary to their dogmas are actuated by selfish motives or under foreign influence, nay, are pronounced traitors to their country, is such a strength of presumption that can't be reconciled with laudable motives, especially when we see the same set of men endeavoring to destroy all confidence in the administration by arraigning all its acts without knowing on what ground or on what information it proceeds. And I think we all know, don't we, in this current moment of outlets who just decide every morning they are going to run down whatever has happened the day before. And Washington is angry about this, and as I say, I think that anger seeps through into the grammar of this extraordinarily long sentence. He says, these things were evidently intended and could not fail without counteraction to disquiet the public mind, but he does have faith in the American system. He says, I hope they will work to their own cure, people will see what's going on, and they will reject them. And then I come to his farewell address. And his farewell address is often quoted just in snippets. And I, again, could have spent an hour talking about this, and I won't, I promise. But I want to think about his second resignation. So his first resignation had been a warning to the country to change their system of government, and he had reluctantly, and after much persuasion, taken part in what I think he thought was a successful effort of reform. But he did worry that it needed an effort to keep it going. And he famously warns his countrymen about permanent associations, picking up on this idea that these permanent clubs, these permanent groups that set themselves against the broader interest of the nation, these are difficult. In Washington's theory of Republican government, people should engage with each other as citizens, not as members of clubs, permanent clubs. So he asks people to reject all obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations, under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, and counteract or the regular deliberation and the action of constituted authorities. In Washington's view of Republican government, and it's a very old-fashioned view that was scarcely shared even by many of his contemporaries, the constitutions of the states and the national government create the proper fora for debate and discussion, and they should be energetic, and they should be used, and people should lobby them, and they should talk to them, but that is the place where the state should work out its differences. He warns people against the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by a spirit of revenge. He says this will be the ruin of public liberty. And then he ends on this amazing note of humility, almost humility, very 18th century humility. He says, look, I've set out a lot of principles in this address, and again, please do go and read the full text of the farewell address. It is worth your time. How far in the discharge of my own official duties I've been guided by the principles which have been delineated, the public records and other evidences of my conduct must be witness to you and the world. To myself, the assurance of my own conscience is that I have at least believed myself to be guided by them. This is the 18th century humility. He says, though reviewing incidents of my administration I am unconscious of intentional error, so he doesn't actually own to any mistakes he's conscious of. He says, I am nevertheless sensible of my defects, and I'm sensible of my defects, not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. And whatever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils of which they may tend. I carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence. And then he knows he's about to die, and hopes that he will be well remembered, and ends with a prayer for the nation. So, Washington's role in the convention. Yes, a silent figure in the record, but an incredibly important figure, but not because of the power that the presidency would exercise. I don't think that was what Washington was interested in. Yes, he wanted energetic government, and you will find many letters where he talks about the need for a presidency that can act with efficiency and secrecy and dispatch. But he is far more concerned to make sure that it is a dignified office and worthy of the nation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Nicholas. We're going to finish out this session with a conversation. And at the outset of that, I actually wanted to recognize that we've got a few folks joining us this afternoon who have contributed in an especially meaningful way by their support of the center and the work of our students to the study of our Constitution, to the preservation of our constitutional order, and making sure that it is passed on to the next generation. One of those is Brian Wood. Brian and Angela Wood have established the Eric Zachary Wood Scholarship in the center, and the student assistants who work on the Quill Project are supported by that work. It's been very important to their formation and having a generational impact on those students. Also, Loria Sterling is with us, who has supported the Quill Project and the work there, and also established, to our joy, the David and Loria Sterling Family Foundation Chair in Constitutional Studies, which is occupied by Verlin Lewis, who does us tremendous credit. Also, there's at least one member of the America 250 Commission here, and Utah's America 250 Commission has committed itself to helping us recover our understanding of the American founding, the Declaration of Independence. Catherine Assay is with us today from the Commission, and they have been kind to co-sponsor many of our events as we make common cause to rejuvenate. I sometimes use words like rejuvenate, recover, the study of the founding and Americans' attachment to it. That is so important, I did want to say, because some of the research that's emerged in recent weeks has pointed to the fact that the more Americans understand about their history and their form of government, it actually tends to temper their outlook on their fellow citizens, their attachment to civil discourse, their respect for constitutional norms. So it is actually quite important that we have long conversations about how our government was established. So in that spirit, I've got one more friend to introduce to you. Carson Holloway is joining us. Carson comes to us from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He is where he is the department chair and professor in political science there, and he is joining us as a distinguished visiting fellow in civic thought this semester, and has been, joining us remotely and then flying back and forth as he is this week to co-teach some of our students in a seminar on the Federalist Papers. We have students who are getting to spend an entire semester marinating in the political thought of the American founding with the Federalist. In fact, we've been talking about getting this T-shirt. One of our other colleagues, our distinguished visiting scholar Bradford Wilson, is involved in that as well. Has mentioned getting there's a T-shirt that says Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 essays in 6 months. You'll get through this. We think we're going to get all the students. Just one essay, guys, really. So let's move forward with this conversation. We've got 2 microphones, so I'll share with you, Carson, and Nicholas can hog the mic down at the other end. That's fine. So, Washington statesmanship. What is most important to remember about Washington statesmanship as it relates to our constitutional order? I mean, if you sort of had to rank it, I mean, what's the thing that Washington contributed to the establishment of our constitutional order that you would want our fellow citizens to recall?
That's a great question and a difficult question. The things that came to my mind when I was listening to the excellent presentation were honor, dignity, national greatness. These are things that Washington was concerned with, and I think that's a very fruitful avenue of investigation into the founding itself. Not that I want to diminish the natural rights doctrine or the idea of individual rights. That's very, very important. But a lot of the developments that led into the revolution could be understood as matters of honor. Like you mentioned, not being worthy of having a commission, feeling slighted by the British. That ultimately builds up into this idea that we're being treated like second-class subjects. Does that make sense? Second-class members of the empire. And that's not satisfactory, and you get the revolution from that. And then again, when it comes to the ratification of the Constitution, there's a lot of concern on Washington's part, and other people's too, with the dignity of the nation, its ability to fulfill its obligations, its ability to take care of itself and protect itself. So this idea of honor is very important, I think, and I was glad you emphasized that. But the other thing that I wrote down in my notes as I was thinking about it was prudence. If we're thinking about the virtues that he brings to bear upon the establishment of the constitutional order, prudence is surely one of them. I mean, Washington was famous among those who knew him well for the care and caution with which he approached any decision he had to make. And he thought about this very carefully in his contributions to the establishment of the Constitution. We can say that on top of the role that he played at the convention, because the mere words of the document don't establish all the norms and all the practices and all the kinds of institutions that would have to exist to put the machine into motion. And he was very self-conscious about the fact that I will establish precedents that will be observed for a long time. And that's why he sought Adams' advice about the dignity of the presidency, which also has to do with honor, the dignity of the office, getting advice not only from him but from others about just how should I conduct myself, you could say in the public relations aspects, dealing with the ordinary citizens and things like that, but also with regard to how do you exercise executive power? Will there be such a thing as executive privilege, although I don't use that term at that time, right? And again, apart from the specific answers to which he was conducted by his own reasoning, informed by the people to whom he listened, what's impressive is just the spirit of deliberation with which he undertook all those tasks. Getting advice from a lot of people, getting advice from people whose opinions he knew would differ so that he could listen to all sides of a question. So I think those virtues are very important and a big part of his constitutional legacy. You know, the other people like Hamilton and Madison and others are more important for their theoretical contributions. They're highly trained lawyers. Washington didn't even go to college, although he's a very intelligent man, you can tell from the passages that you read. But yeah, his mind is not as theoretical as theirs, so you don't think about things like the debate between Jefferson and Hamilton over how to understand the necessary and proper clause. Although Washington does come down on the Hamiltonian side of that, he's not the man to write 40,000 words on it the way Hamilton did. But he wanted those 40,000 words so that he could read them before he made a decision. So those are the things I would think about.
I'm interested in this idea that Washington cultivates deliberation among the people around him, because we think of people in that kind of position of command. I mean, he exercises a power and an influence that is obviously not unparalleled, but certainly among Republican leaders within a constitutional regime is very rare. How does he go about cultivating exercising this kind of leadership and cultivating deliberation in people? Can you give me any examples of that? How does he do this? Nicholas, you want to?
Well, I think you see it as a thread that runs through his life. You know, I read a little bit of the correspondence. I'll start again. I think you see it as a thread that runs through his life. I read a little bit of the correspondence. You know, this decision: should he attend the convention? Should he not? He's writing to people on the subject. He's talking to the governor. He's talking to other people. He's aware of his own role. Would it be prudent for him? Is it in the national interest to attend or not to attend? He's taking advice on this. He wants reassurance. Beyond saying that he would like a national government that can properly fulfill its role, he's not writing theoretical treaties, but he's taking advice on how it should be done. He likes the idea of a convention. And then if I just think about his role as chair, people can chair things in different ways. They could chair things in different ways in the 18th century. He chooses as chair of the convention to say little formally. I'm sure he was saying a lot in the evenings, and we know from his bar bill throwing terrific parties as well. But he was saying very little formally in the debates. He was letting the debates happen. And he carries that through into his presidency. He is prepared to make decisions when decisions need to be taken. He is prepared to take responsibility for difficult decisions, including putting on a uniform and going out to meet with the troops that are putting down a rebellion. He is not afraid of difficult decisions, but wherever he can, and we see this in the correspondence that he writes, he is taking he's asking people to write down their opinions, not even just to deliver them. You know, he asks Jefferson to write down and Hamilton to write down their positions on different things so that he can consider it carefully. And I think that is part of his leadership.
Yeah, I do a little bit. I mean, I think I just to agree with that. I mean, on that one question, which he took very seriously, I should say, I mentioned prudence and honor. He was very prudent about his honor. He thought hard about how to protect it and how not to be overly concerned with it, but to be properly concerned with it. So this question of whether he should attend the convention or not, he wrote to a lot of people whose judgment he respected, different versions of almost the same letter, so that he could get advice from many of them. And it's a way in which he manifests his humility. He used the word humility in some of those documents that you were examining. And you think about it, Washington is a proud man. He is a proud man in some ways, but he's also a humble man because he's willing to ask other people's advice. He doesn't pretend that he has all the answers himself. And sometimes I think we, or at least I, when I was younger, I read Aristotle on prudence and magnanimity or greatness of soul. You can conjure up in your mind this idea of somebody like a Washington or a Lincoln who just has it all within themselves and they process everything and they make a decision. But some time ago, I was reading a work of moral theology, and it came to the section on prudence, and one of the questions it asked was, do you seek the advice of other people? That's a good point to make, and I think in politics, sometimes because of the drive to acquire honor and to achieve distinction and to be thought of as kind of on a higher plane, there could be a temptation toward a kind of foolish autonomy. You think you can decide everything yourself, call all the shots. And Washington was very far from doing that. He's very humble about getting other people's views and thinking them through. So I think it's a good lesson for anybody who has to do anything from being department chair up to being president.
That's the sequence of attainment? Department chair to president? Okay. Where do directors fall? That's what I want to know. I'd actually like to open up for some questions from the audience. If you guys have questions about Washington, about this period of the founding, even other questions that bear on the Constitution that we can perhaps hazard an attempt to answer. Alicia, and why don't you, okay, yeah, we'll do that. We'll carry the microphone about.
In preparing a lesson on executive power using Quill, I learned more of the debate around how to choose the president. And I was really surprised, I can't remember who said it, if it was Sherman or another person, of arguing that Congress should choose the president because the president should be carrying out the laws of Congress. So it's really kind of more of a creature of Congress. But then there's the separation of powers. So they ultimately decide not to have Congress choose. They create the Electoral College. So what I want to know from you is, how much does Washington understand that he's carrying out the laws that Congress has created, or how much is he thinking that I need to establish the presidency to be its separate own branch?
It's a great question.
It's a terrific question. I mean, the overwhelming amount of time, in a way, the convention spent on the presidency is spent on how the president should be chosen. And there are a lot of different ideas and a lot of different conflicting theories, not only about what would result in a good selection, but what would be the properly Republican thing to do. And I think you put it perfectly. There's a tension between this idea that there ought to be a proper separation of powers so that the president can properly interject if Congress is doing something unconstitutional. The original thought around the veto is very bound up with the idea that one of the most important, perhaps the most important, perhaps the most legitimate reason for the president to veto a piece of legislation is if he or she thinks that it is unconstitutional. That's so how can somebody who depends on their next election on Congress properly exercise that? So there was concern around that, but there was also concern that the president should properly execute the law. Washington is very, very careful about this. Washington takes a copy of the Constitution and he very carefully studies and annotates what the responsibilities of the president are and makes notes to himself, and he is very, very careful to stay within the bounds of the law. Some of his very, very rapid successors, and Jefferson in particular, were rather less careful and had reasons for thinking differently. But Washington is very clear that he's been given a trust that he's going to abide by. But that doesn't mean it's all plain sailing. He doesn't quite know how he's going to relate to Congress. So the Constitution says frequently that he should take the advice and consent of the Senate. So he does initially try and go and do that. I mean, imagine that if the president went to the Senate from time to time to take their advice. He tries it once, and all of these arguments about separation of powers come up. And Washington is deeply embarrassed and storms out and never goes back. And no president has gone since to try and do that. So he is trying to work out all of these things, but I think in his vision of the presidency, a scrupulous and careful study of the law was really important. And over the bank bill, which was he wants to be assured that it is constitutional if he's going to sign it. It's not just is this a good idea. He wants clear authority. So he's not somebody that's just going to use the weight of his office to force things through.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And your point about separation of powers reminds me that we're doing the class on the Federalist, and in the Federalist, at some point, Alexander Hamilton says, subordination to the laws is a very different thing from subordination to the legislative power or to the Congress. The president, in the system of separation of powers, has an obligation to execute the laws, but he also has an obligation not to let Congress micromanage how the laws are executed. Execution is considered to be a different task. And I think part of the reason it takes so much prudence and care to take care of the executive power right from the beginning is because it is a complex thing. To some extent, the executive's job is to execute law enacted by Congress. And to that extent, you are kind of a secondary actor, right? You're carrying into execution something that someone else has decided, in its broad outlines at least. But the executive power does also include some things, and not just small things, but important things, where the president exercises his own discretion. And Washington was careful to take care of that side of it too. I think about the Neutrality Proclamation. When the war broke out between England and France, and there was a lot of thought put into what our posture should be toward those two very powerful nations. I think there was general agreement that we should be neutral, but some people were more friendly to Britain, others more friendly to France among Washington's cabinet, Jefferson and Hamilton. But he could have, this is counterfactual, one could conceive of Washington as sending some message over to the Senate and the House and saying, I think neutrality is really important here. Can't you guys work up some kind of neutrality resolution to pass? He didn't do that. He passed his own. He signed his own neutrality proclamation, not really asserting any legal power of his own, but just it's based upon the observation or his conclusion that since we have not declared war, we are in fact in a state of peace with these two nations, and then admonishing Americans to behave consistently with the state of peace and don't do anything that will drag us into it. So it's very carefully modulated so that he's not sort of asserting his own right to decide what the state is, but he's asserting his own right to inform Americans what the state is because Congress has not declared war. So it's important and carefully crafted assertion of presidential authority.
May I add a small note to that? So this is going to be an afternoon of just agreeing with each other repeatedly. I'm so glad you brought up that. I encouraged you to read the farewell address. He dedicates a significant section of the farewell address to defending the Neutrality Proclamation. He is very, very, he not only thinks it was the right policy, and he not only thinks that America should, as far as possible, remain neutral in world affairs, but I think he's also aware that this was a moment where he had, yes, within the law and within the Constitution and within his understanding of the war power that's given to Congress, he had decided to declare this, and he was aware that he was going to be criticized for it, and he dedicates a very long section both to admonish America to stay out of foreign entanglements, but also to defend his decision in that case. I think he's nervous about it.
Any other questions for the panel?
Why is it that we don't see more Washingtons or Washington types in American history? We often, surveys of American citizens suggest that the only kind of potential rival, which I think one of you mentioned is Abraham Lincoln, as far as someone that has the character and the capacity and the prudence to be able to lead in such a way. We're in the business here in the Center for Constitutional Studies in cultivating future civic leaders. Is it just that great moments are necessary to call forth great people? We've had other wars since, so it doesn't seem to be that just great conflict is necessary. Why don't we see more George Washingtons?
That's a tough question. Would one of you like to hazard an answer to this?
I'm not a theologian or a philosopher. I'm sure they could give answers, and I can guess what they would be. May I just give you a simple historian's empirical answer, which is just to recognize the fact that good leadership is rare, and we celebrate it when it exists because it is rare. And if it weren't rare, we'd need rather less work to preserve good government, I think.
It reminds me, there's this story of Beethoven walking through some public park, and so these people are pointing at some duke, and he's not interested, and they say to him, "Why not?" And he says, "There's a lot of dukes, there's only one Beethoven." So like, you could take the view that there aren't a lot of Washington types because there is no Washington type, right? He is sort of in a class by himself. I mean, I think that we've had a lot of, if you're talking about the level of presidential leadership, we had a lot of presidents. Some of them are not very good. Most of them are kind of decent, right? Some of them are tough-minded, conscientious, admirable people. There's only probably 3 who are really extraordinary, kind of highly unusual human beings. I mean, Lincoln is like that. Washington's like that. So it's, probably, you could learn a lot from his virtues and try to aspire to be like him, but to I'm at a loss for words almost, but I guess one thing I'm veering into is, you read the founding documents and they talk about the need to be aware that you won't always have somebody really great as president, and they say things like a prodigy of virtue such as comes only once in a century, and they're talking about George Washington. I mean, the people who know me personally are not saying things like that about me. So it may be the case that we can aspire to those things but not expect to totally attain them, but we can attain something that's maybe in the ballpark or certainly worthy of attainment.
Who's the third?
I'm not going to say.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it to your imagination, I suppose.
I'll say one more thing, because I enjoyed the fact that one of the, if you go to any collection of Washington's papers, if you go to any one-volume collection, there's a document preserved from his youth, and I've never gone into how this school exercise came to be preserved, and I so apologies, I can't tell you, but more about it. But it is a list of rules of civilized behavior, and Washington, as a very young man, and I think it is one of the earliest documents we have from his life, if not the earliest, set out a list for himself of rules of civilized behavior. So he studied and thought about this. Now, he's not a philosopher. He doesn't organize these in any kind of hierarchy. He doesn't elaborate on them. They'll be amusing if you go and read them. They will range from things that seem quite important about truthfulness to things that seem relatively trivial. But he did at least reflect upon virtue early in his life, and I think we see that later through his life, that he reflected on what it took to be virtuous.
I think we might have time for one more question. Oh, I got one right here.
Sorry, I realized that the documentary record may not support a full answer beyond speculation, but you mentioned, Dr. Cole, Washington speaks up other than to chastise being lax with records. He speaks up one time, and it's to endorse a change in the ratio of citizens or population to representatives. As the questions discussed in the convention go, that seems quite trivial. So why do you think that was the one that he felt compelled to speak up about?
Because Washington was a Republican, and he believed in the Republican experiment, and he believed that America shouldn't be a monarchy. And he thinks that he is perhaps more aware than anybody else at the convention that getting it through the process of ratification is going to be difficult. And you know, many people are arguing, well, let's keep Congress quite small so that debate is manageable. You know, should we have a large number of representatives or a small number of representatives? And he says, I mean, we only have a very brief description of what he says, but what he says is, this will do much to reassure people that Republican principle is really important, that people must be able to feel a connection to their representative. And of course that becomes, I mean, he's quite right, that becomes the focus of so much of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debate. And the Anti-Federalists make a lot of hay with the idea that there aren't enough even then, that the ratio should have been even bigger. So it seems to us a trivial matter because districts have become so enormous. Washington didn't think it was a trivial matter. I think as well, he sat through 3 months of debate, and he's held his tongue, at least officially. And this is one of the last amendments. And you know, perhaps there is just a sense that now that all of the really difficult stuff has been agreed, maybe I can speak my mind on this thing that I think is important.
Well, I'm grateful that you all have joined us for this session. I want to remind those who are joining us online, as well as those of you in person, that the Center has a robust series of programming like this. We are routinely engaged in bringing people to speak to our students and our community, to remind them about what is enduring and what is most important in their constitutional order. Our mission statement, the Center says that we're here to study the ideas and practices essential to the perpetuation of constitutional government, ordered liberty, and the rule of law. And as you've heard this morning, or this afternoon, I think, Washington's example tells us, at least in part, that a preoccupation with our rights is not enough. That a consideration of whether we have the sufficient virtue to undertake the responsibilities of citizens, to perform our responsibilities to others. If you think about this, many of the ordinary responsibilities of life are not about claiming our rights. They're about fulfilling our obligations to our children, to our families, to our fellow citizens, to our employers, to our employees, in all of the relationships of life that's so critically important, and reminds us that the liberty that we hold dear, the freedom that marks a just and free political society, rests on the ability of citizens and statesmen to exercise virtue, to perpetuate it, and to defend it. And Washington is indeed a model of that. And I hope this has been edifying for you all. You can find more about our programming on our website at uvu.edu/ccs, and check out our podcast, This Constitution, as well as the many other things the Center does. Thank you very much. For those, that was peremptory for the live feed. But for those of you who are present, we're going to break for about 5 minutes. We got to reconfigure things here a little bit, and then we're going to hear from another colleague about our work on the Declaration of Independence and the Quill Project. So I'd invite you to stay for that. We'll resume in about 5 minutes. In the meantime, there are, of course, restrooms and other things. And thank you for joining us. right, well, welcome back. We're continuing our programming on our 2025 Constitution Day, which celebrates America Cincinnatus, George Washington's constitutional legacy. And this last session, I'm actually really excited about this because we've been working with the Quill Project on a special model. We normally work on constitutional conventions. Quill's worked on treaties, other countries' constitutions, state constitutions. Did you all know, by the way, that Americans had written and ratified 235 state constitutions? Well, we've been doing something special for the last better part of a year and are going to continue doing it for a while. We've been working on the Declaration of Independence, and we have been trying to use the tools that the Quill Project provides to pull apart and make clearer just how we got the text of the Declaration of Independence. Not just the ideas that are in it, but how is that text constructed? It is, after all, probably certainly the most well-known piece of political rhetoric America has ever produced, and possibly our most important statement of our political principles. So in engaging in that project, we have been working alongside, as always, our students and staff, been working alongside our colleagues in Oxford, and I'm going to introduce you today to one of those colleagues. Holly Megson is a senior documentary editor with the Quill Project at Pembroke College and Oxford University. And for all of us who work on these projects, Holly is familiar to us, and is just a wonderful colleague to work with. But I'm going to introduce her to you today because she's going to share with you the character of this project that we're undertaking on the Declaration, what it's adding to our knowledge. And I will also say, by way of maybe embarrassing her a little bit, I got to see this presentation given at the Anderson House in Washington, D.C., which is the home of the Society of the Cincinnati, in a wonderful American Revolution conference that was put on earlier this week. And Holly did a phenomenal job there and wowed our colleagues in history and politics who were on hand to see it. So I'm glad that we'll now get to share it with all of you. And please join me in welcoming Holly Megson.
Sorry, I'll start again. In his own design of his tombstone, Jefferson declared himself the author of the Declaration of Independence. In doing so, he perhaps disregarded one of the most fundamental features of the Revolutionary era, the Republican way of doing government, which is to say, in the tradition of participation, collaboration, and consensus. A more appropriate epitaph, and certainly one that better reflects Jefferson's actual role, might be that of draftsman. Despite Jefferson composing the document which asserted the intention of the colonies to be independent states, this was by no means a one-man endeavor. And although Jefferson may have wanted himself to be immortalized as the author of American liberty, scholars like Pauline Maier are contributing to a growing body of scholarship that better reflects his important but contextualized and balanced role. The Declaration of Independence is among the most studied pieces of political literature in history. Indeed, as a foundational text of the United States of America, the Declaration has received no shortage of historiographical interrogation, though the fascinating process through which it took shape has received far less attention than the philosophies which underpinned it and influenced it, or its role in shaping the development of the world's most renowned system of republican government. For the purposes of this presentation, I wish to confine our focus simply to the drafting process of the Declaration, who wrote it, and the ways it was written. By drafting, I refer not to Hazelton's interpretation, which pertained to the physical location in which the document was written, a room in the lodgings of Jacob Graff in Philadelphia. Instead, I want to refer to the development of the text from early to late June in 1776. This means understanding the contributions and roles of its authors, Jefferson, but also Adams, Franklin, and the Committee of the Whole at large. The draft began with the appointment of the Committee of Five on the 11th of June, subsequent to the passage of Richard Henry Lee's Resolution for Independence. It was decided that the responsibility for crafting the initial draft would fall to Jefferson. Precisely how this was decided is disputed. In 1822, in a letter addressed to Thomas Pickering, Adams recalled the appointment of a subcommittee consisting of himself and Jefferson, in which he stated that Jefferson ought to write. He believed this for 4 reasons. First, Jefferson was from the newly established and influential state of Virginia. Second, as a Southerner, Jefferson was devoid of the revolutionary connotations which enshrouded those from the North. Third, unlike Adams, Jefferson had not openly supported independence in Congress. And finally, Jefferson had what Adams described as a better command of the written word. Conversely, in 1823, Jefferson rebutted this claim, and he argued that he was appointed the draftsman with the unanimous consent of the committee. Now, these discrepant accounts speak to how memory is susceptible to distortion, especially in a context where profound demands were asked of the individuals by Congress on the eve of revolution. By my own review of the journals of the Continental Congress, Jefferson and Adams were appointed to 9 and 12 committees respectively, from the 1st of May to the presentation of the Declaration on the 28th of June. This is not including the Committee of 5. It is no wonder that amid war, revolution, and the birth of a new republic, their recollections are hazy. In the absence of a robust documentary record, Jefferson's account, as the primary author of the Declaration, has often dominated over Adams. And although not a topic for today, how and even why Jefferson came to be the draftsman should solicit a great deal of historical inquiry. Unlike the available documentary record, research exploring the textual development of the Declaration is abundant. Scholars like Becker, Mayer, Boyd, and Hazleton have all certainly contributed to an extensive commentary on the drafting process of the Declaration. Many of them have even offered a variety of approximations of the text to chart the various life stages of the document. But these approximations largely focus on the penultimate draft, that is, the document received by Congress. By using our Quill software, I believe I can offer the first insight into the full secondary or tertiary draft. This is possible because one of the most useful features of the Quill platform is the ability to track the development of a negotiated text over time by displaying track changes via a visual model. This is a recreation only of the secondary draft, or perhaps the tertiary draft, as there is an extant fragment of the original draft, commonly referred to as a composition draft, which is unfortunately incomplete. Now, this fragment can be found in the Library of Congress and consists of a paragraph, a line, and a further paragraph which was written upside down. Obvious in this fragment is Jefferson's frustration with the betrayal of his perceived British brethren for their failure to respond to their grievances and their treatment by the king. Now, Boyd's analysis of this document against a later manuscript copy indicates that this is indeed the first extant copy of the Declaration of Independence. This document takes a significantly different form to that of the final draft, as Congress omitted all but 2 of the original clauses. Excluding this fragment, nothing remains of the so-called original paper, which Jefferson referred to in a letter to James Madison in 1823. Reconstructing an earlier draft is therefore a challenge, but certainly possible. We began first by dissecting the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. This is a manuscript copy of the document, which includes successive generations of revisions interlaced on the super and subscript lines in the hand of Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. Post-Revolutionary War, Jefferson chose to annotate this copy by ascribing the various changes to their respective authors. Changes made by Adams were designated by an asterisk, by Franklin, a dagger, and omissions by Congress were enclosed in square brackets. It is possible to strip back this collage of text to produce what we will subsequently call the baseline copy of the rough draft. This copy reproduces the document in its original form, where the layers of revisions have been disregarded to produce a clean copy, that is, devoid of insertions, substitutions, deletions, and grammatical corrections. All grammar and spelling mistakes have been reproduced in this baseline copy, namely Jefferson's misspelling of the word independent with an A, and his use of the contraction IT'(S) in place of the possessive its. From here, I compared this baseline draft, which we were able to create, against the Adams copy. The Adams copy is a near verbatim transcript of the Declaration of Independence as it read when Adams first received the document from Jefferson. Although, admittedly, there are a few minor discrepancies between this version and the baseline copy. Now, excusing the spelling and punctuation discrepancies, we've identified a total of 8 substantive changes between the baseline copy and the Adams copy. In his own analysis, Becker employed a similar method of comparison, with a minor difference. He utilized the Adams copy in conjunction with the rough draft to create the document as it likely read when received by Franklin. This document omits the corrections of Adams and Franklin, meaning that Becker believed that Franklin was the first recipient of the document. This I disagree with. Instead, I favor the interpretation offered by Boyd, that Adams received the document prior to Franklin. This is because Adams copied the words "under absolute power" in the second paragraph. These are words that do not feature in the baseline copy or the final copy, thus proving that this amendment came in 2 halves and, as proven by the handwriting, was enacted by 2 individuals. The term "under absolute" was a change introduced by Jefferson after his initial composition of the draft, but before the document was received by Adams. And the word "power" was inserted by Adams, and in the final copy, it reads "despotism," which was a change by Franklin, thus proving that Adams definitely received the document first, which is also corroborated by the fact that Franklin was suffering from a severe case of gout at the time and was absent from Congress for much of June. Nevertheless, whilst Becker's reproduction was did not intend to outline all of the errors made by Adams, he does signpost some of the inconsistencies he spotted in the footnotes. I unfortunately also contest some of these supposed inconsistencies. First, he claims that in the second paragraph of the Adams draft, that Adams wrote for light or transient causes rather than light and transient causes as it reads in the original. It is evident from consulting the manuscript that this is not correct. Secondly, Becker falsely claims that Adams omitted the letter S from the following words: constitutions, allurements, and rights. Whilst the S on these words is admittedly small, it does match the form of the S employed in the word inhabitants, proving that this was a misunderstanding on Becker's part. Now, this is doubtless the consequence of less advanced technology, and Becker can certainly be excused, having made these claims in 1922. Discrepancies between my interpretation and Becker's aside, I was able to propose the Adams copy, again, excluding spelling and punctuation differences as an amendment to the baseline copy through Quill, enabling me to identify which changes were made when, between the initial composition of the draft and Adams' receipt of the document. In doing so, we identified a total of 9 changes. These are the following. In paragraph 2, the words "sacred and undeniable" were substituted for "self-evident." Again, in paragraph 2, the word "in" was deleted before the words "rights," and we presume that this was a grammatical change that Jefferson made as he was writing that paragraph. The third change is again in paragraph 2, and it's the substitution of the words "subject them to arbitrary power" to "reduce them under absolute power." In paragraph 5, the words "in the legislature" were inserted after the words "the right of representation." In paragraph 7, Jefferson chose to delete an incomplete sentence. Again, we presume that this was a change made as he was directly writing. In the penultimate paragraph, Jefferson also changed the words "glory and happiness" for "happiness and glory." He similarly struck out the words "in a separately state" for the words "apart from them." And he substituted the word "pronounces" for "denounces." And lastly, he substituted the words everlasting adieu for eternal separation. Interestingly, this method also supports a theory presented by Becker and Boyd, which is that Jefferson met with Adams and Franklin on at least 2 occasions. In his post-revolutionary annotations to the rough draft, only 2 amendments were attributed to Adams. First, to strike out the words, His Present Majesty, and replace them with the present King of Great Britain on page 1 of the rough draft. And second, the insertion of the words, after such dissolutions in the 5th grievance clause on page 2 of the rough draft. Notably, the First Amendment concerning the King does not feature in the Adams copy. This absence suggests that this amendment was made at a different time. We can employ the same method of using Quill to the composition draft, the earliest fragment that we have, enabling us to envision the document as it first read. In doing so, we recognize that 21 changes were made by Jefferson to this single fragment, a testament to the extent of deliberation, both internal and external, that went into this document at all stages of its development. The fundamental benefit of the Quill software is that it allows us to recapture the Declaration from as it appears in the National Archives in DC to the first scraps of paper drafted by its authors. There's no doubt that Jefferson wrote the lion's share of the Declaration and should be considered no less central in what it created in the American Republic. However, the drafting of this document was by no means a one-man show, but rather the culmination of collaboration and deliberation, and belongs to a broader tradition of collective authorship, which was common of the Revolutionary era democratic process. This should certainly be celebrated, not least as it is so hugely appropriate for a document that birthed a nation built on the principle of collective representative government. Ultimately, what I have explored is just a small but important episode in a broader project that looks how the consensus of independence was reached and the forms of words used to encapsulate the American grievances. This is part of a larger project that we hope to publish in early 2026 ahead of the semi-quintennial anniversary. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to give you folks a chance to ask any questions about this, including Holly now knows everything there is to be known about the creation of the Declaration of Independence. So please fire away if you have any curiosity about what we're working on and how this is unfolding.
I guess while you were looking at this, was there any changes that surprised you specifically? And
Oh,
why?
that is a good question. I think there was no one amendment that I was surprised by the content. I think all of the different stages of revision, be it by Jefferson privately, by Adams, Franklin, the potential Committee of Five, we don't know if the Committee of Five met before it was submitted to Congress, and also the changes made by Congress all seem to make sense. They're all reflective of the individuals that suggested that amendment. For instance, Congress wanted to temper a lot of the language about the king, and that made sense to me. I think what surprised me was just the amount of revision that Jefferson did before it was sent to anyone else, as proven by the composition draft. There was an entirely other piece of paper that we don't have access to, and we have no idea if that was the first one. That's just simply the earliest document that we've found. So yes, I think the extent of deliberation was what surprised me more so than any particular amendment.
What were some of the themes in a lot of the revisions going forward and the way that the rhetoric changed over the over each iteration of the document?
I think, there were I mean, there were several amendments, but I guess we can kind of group them into stylistic amendments. Franklin definitely proposed a lot of stylistic amendments. He wanted to make Jefferson's language snappier, as did many of the members of the Committee of the Whole. But there are also many substantive amendments. I mean, Jefferson's paragraph on slavery was famously omitted. So I think it's interesting that there were two. The revision process was both to ensure that the document was as coherent and succinct as it could be, but they were also very conscious that in many ways the document was one of America's first press releases. They were trying to justify why they should be independent, and they were very conscious that they had to do so in a very articulate way.
It might be the new title of the project, America's First Press Release. Actually, I wanted to add one thing on this point. Adams, at least, corresponds with Abigail Adams and talks a little bit about changes in the list of grievances. And he notes that they tried to eliminate those grievances that suggested any kind of personal animosity, and also those that would be insulting to the British people. So you want to keep the criticism aimed solidly at the government. That's sort of so it is interesting. They're quite sensitive to the way this is going to be received elsewhere. Scott, you had a question?
So, what you were able to discover about the sequencing of the drafting process and is the drafting process using Quill, how does that compare to what Mayer was able to? How she understood the sequencing, and then also, I guess, her take relative to Becker and the earlier scholars who worked on it.
Frustratingly for us, we spent a lot of time looking at Mayer's work and trying to dissect what she believed, and she very cleverly doesn't assert a robust or particularly strong argument at any point, which isn't a critique of her work. It's actually very clever how she manages to discuss a declaration at such length without ever asserting a clear chronology. What we speculated is that she defers to Becker and Becker's account when she created her Appendix C, which is her reproduction, similar to what we have done. But she was focusing on what the document looked like before Congress received it. In that, she used much of Becker's own reproduction, and as I said, he speculates that Franklin was the first recipient, and then Adams, so I guess in that way, I definitely differ with her interpretation, but again, she was very clever in focusing her work on the actual drafting of the text rather than the transfer of the text between its various authors, unhelpfully for us.
I have some questions then. I wondered about, there's all this stuff that happens outside of Congress. So, I mean, what do we expect to find coming from outside? I mean, we usually think of a deliberative body of, sort of deliberating internally. Individuals come in with their different prejudices and ideas, and they construct the text. But here we've got a lot of stuff flowing toward Congress from outside, state and local committees, and there's even a previous Congress, the First Continental Congress. All sorts of bodies are sending things. So how does all that surrounding stuff help us understand what's in the Declaration, or how might it?
Well, that's actually part of the second phase of the project that we're looking at, which is exploring the local antecedents to the Declaration and if the language of them in any way informed them. Unfortunately, we haven't done a huge amount of work there yet, but I think some of the other influences external to Congress that informed the Declaration were definitely the British Declaration of Rights from the 1600s, Jefferson's own draft of the Virginia Constitution definitely informed much of his work. And then similarly, George Mason's Virginia Bill of Rights was all language that Jefferson, if he didn't directly draw on the text, he definitely drew from their sentiments. And in fact, Jefferson borrowed the list of grievance style format that was present in the English Declaration of Rights. So there are very clear ancestors, as it were, to this document.
Any final questions? Project? Well, if not, well, please join me in thanking Holly for. And I will mention in closing that, these kinds of projects, like the Declaration project that we're engaged in, they're an important focal point for us. It is the case that a lot of our academic disciplines and a lot of our energy and resources within higher education and academia have not really been aimed at the American founding for a very long time. And it's a very encouraging thing that I think with the 250th anniversary approaching, we're reminded of the need to reinvigorate an examination of our founding, partly because we've inherited it. We often like to talk about the American founding as a pre-partisan inheritance. The political principles that we shaped and the institutions that we created predate our political parties. And they really do form a pre-partisan foundation for American politics that we can, from every side of the political aisle, appeal to and utilize to try to convince our fellow citizens of what is best for us as a country. And so it's very important in that regard, but it's also critical because we can learn from it. Because we've inherited not just the material, the product of the American founding, but hopefully we've inherited a set of civic virtues, political practices, and political institutions that we can employ skillfully and virtuously in the furtherance of our own good as citizens and for the good of our country. So this is an opportunity for us to lead the way in doing that. And that's what the Center for Constitutional Studies is determined to do as we approach this important anniversary. So thank you for joining us for this, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.